Good evening, everybody. Thank you for tuning in. This is At the Table. I'm your host, Maui Jones. Let's just hop right into it. Okay, so the year is 1991. Imagine there's a storm brewing in the distance. The air heavy with dread, the sky a deep shade of gray. Imagine a cold front joining forces with a hurricane, creating a catastrophic nor'easter that brought devastation and chaos to the region. In 1991, those people didn't have to imagine it because they lived it. They called it the no-name storm. They called it the Halloween gale, or most famously, the perfect storm. Most notable from that event was the deaths of 6 crew members of the Andrea Gale, a fishing boat, forever lost at sea. They even made a movie about it with George Clooney and Marky Mark. Now, in this movie, we see a crew bravely making a decision to head into the storm to bring their haul of fish home. That's not true, however, but it is the narrative that most people believe due to the sensationalizing of it. In actuality, the boat had been 3 days into its steam home before encountering the storm. Now, you may wonder what this has to do. I'm sure you saw the title of this by now. This has to do with the Proviso Board of Education's issues. Well, today we see a very different kind of storm brewing, one that's been years in the making. 209 School District is facing a confluence of events that could be described as a perfect storm. Race, deep-seated racial tensions, intersecting with rapidly changing demographics, and embattled board members and a controversial superintendent have all created a situation that threatens the education and well-being, not of 6 men, but of thousands of children. Tonight, I'm going to have a conversation with Michael Romain, who has been covering this since it started, since the formation of 209 Together, through the hiring of Henderson, to some of the recent reporting that has been happening in terms of federal lawsuits, and coming soon, his coverage on the proposed charter school that will be that they're trying to bring about in Proviso District. It's not going to be easy talking about this, trying to identify what's happening in the district, the various narratives involved, and the systemic inequities that have led us to this point. But it is necessary. Our children's futures depend on it. So let's bring in Michael Romain. Mike, he's coming in by audio, so you'll just be blessed with my face today, but we'll be hearing Mike's wonderful words. Mike, how you doing, man?
Hey, how's it going, Maui?
So where do you want to start? You want to kind of talk about how you see it, the threads that are kind of intersecting to create this situation in 209?
Sure. No, you painted a pretty vivid picture. That's a really good metaphor to describe the different but interrelated forces that are kind of battering the district right now. It have been for several years.
Yeah. Let's start with, I think the easiest one to start with, perhaps, is the board. All 7 members currently were part of a slate 209 together. Can you talk a little bit about that, like the formation and the rise and fall of 209 together, or Proviso Together, I believe is what their campaign was called?
Yeah, it's Proviso Together,
And
although
not to be
there's one
confused with the scholarship fund 209 together.
right, and not to be confused with D209 Together, which is the name of one of the slates running now. So,
Uh, what slate is and who are the candidates for D209 together?
so there are, and you're testing my memory right now. Teresa Kelly is running with one or two other candidates for the board. I believe it's two other, an African American and a Latina. One is Jada James. The other person's name escapes me. But they are D209 together. The reason I know that is because I got a mailer that came to my house that looked eerily familiar to Proviso Together. I said, must be seeing something, but they it looks like they kept the color scheme and of Proviso Together, and they kept half the name. So
That's interesting.
So it's D209 Together. I only looked at their financial disclosure information for a hot second, but the party is registered. Rodney Alexander is the chairman, if I'm not mistaken. And anybody can go to Illinois Sunshine and look up the parties, the committees, and you can find out more information. But yes, D209 Together is one slate. Proviso United, if I'm not mistaken, is another, and then there's another 2-person slate that Claudia Medina is a current sitting board member, is running.
Medina
She's
and
running.
Kubrick.
Yes, right. And I believe they are just 2 independent candidates who are running an alliance, if I'm not mistaken.
Yes.
And so that's the state of the race. They're basically those 3 factions. And yes, it wouldn't be inaccurate to say that all of those current factions that are running now represent splinters of Proviso Together, which was this big. It was kind of a movement, really, that emerged out of Forest Park, and these group of community members who came together several years ago. At this point, it's been almost a decade. And they formed this group at the Brown Cow in Forest Park, the ice cream parlor. And Connie Onsler Brown, the owner of Brown Cow, was kind of the organizing genius behind, with the help of a lot of other very passionate, active community members, who were just fed up with the state of Proviso high schools at that point. And so they all mobilized. They formed Proviso Together. And it's sort of like what's happening with the United people now, which they came out of a Facebook group, a private Facebook group that was created because in 2021, the Board of Education, namely board president at the time, Rodney Alexander, he basically said, we're not going to record any more public meetings. And there was an outroar. There was a petition started. There were a lot of people who were just angry that it happened, and so the organizers the main organizers, Jeannie Barbahan and Kathleen Francois, of this Facebook group. They came together, and they would tap other community members. Jordan Kane out of Forest Park is another one, who was basically shooting board meetings while the district decided that they would would stop the practice of live streaming meetings. So they would post video of board meetings that they took themselves onto this private Facebook group, so that people could see what was going on, who could not attend the meetings in person. And so that ban on live streaming lasted for about a month, before Rodney, bowing to pressure, reinstated the district's practice. But the group became more organized, and they eventually formed Proviso Together. And all of those people, I'm sorry, not Proviso Together, but the current slate, Proviso United, if I'm not mistaken, or 209 United for 209. I can't remember. I'm sorry, I can't remember all these slates.
I think it's 209 United.
Right. Yeah. But all of those people, Teresa Kelly, obviously, everybody who is basically everybody who is helping out 209 United, and Claudia, were affiliated with Proviso Together. And Claudia, Teresa, both were elected on the Proviso Together slate before it disbanded. And it was 2015, I want to say, was the year that the original Proviso Together people were elected, and they are Teresa, Claudia, and Ned. And then after them, I think it was a year or two after them, Proviso Together ran 4 more people, and that was against a slate created by now House Speaker Chris Welch, who was the former board president of District 209, who eventually went to the State House and was elected Speaker a few years ago. He ran a slate which included his wife, Shantae, who is now a judge, and 3 other people, many of whom I know. And they lost very badly to these Proviso Together candidates. So in 2017, I want to say, Proviso Together had a 7-person supermajority, which is virtually unheard of in school board politics. I think it's safe to say.
Oh yeah, that's like right. That unprecedented. That's why it's so weird to see how it's all kind of exploded.
Yeah,
right.
and
I didn't think about it that way. That like you can piece together the entire movement across these various slates. Be it the community members that helped get them in, be it the 2 sides of the board that kind of splintered, which was mostly Claudia. I feel like kind of on an island against the rest, but really a 4-person contingent within that board. Does that make sense?
Yeah, I think it. I've been hearing. I don't want to introduce speculation, but I had been hearing, things. I'm not going to go into specific things, but I had been hearing things with respect to some contention, things that were causing tension. Pardon me. Between various members of the board. And as you and anybody else who knows or has even been to one board meeting knows, there are some personalities on the board, and they're very colorful, charismatic, aggressive personalities on the board, who really believe in they believe in the things that they do. So I think it was natural and probably inevitable that some personality conflicts would arise. But I think you get beyond the the natural personality conflicts that are going to come up within any organization, within
Mhm.
any board. Um, and they became real splinters. I would say I think that the foundation really started to crack, and it eventually tore completely. I think the rupture is probably it probably goes back to Superintendent Rodriguez, Jesse Rodriguez, him
Yes.
leaving, and when he left, I think he left in 2018 or 19,
Yeah,
right before
actually,
the
I have a quote reporting from you, I believe, in the Forest Park Review. Proviso Township High School District 209 Superintendent Jesse Rodriguez is resigning to take the superintendent position at Zion Benton Township High School District 126. District 126 School Board approved a 3-year contract for Rodriguez at a meeting on December 17th. It goes on to say that the superintendent's decision comes less than a year after the D209 school board voted 4-3 in favor of granting him a new 5-year contract that would have had his annual base salary growing from $257,648 by 2023. District records show. Um, you went on to say Teresa Kelly, the board's longest serving member who voted against the contract, arguing that it was too long, um, said at the same time that the contract was the lengthiest she'd seen during her some 2 decades long tenure on the board.
Yeah, and then she turned around and voted for a 5-year contract for a superintendent who hadn't been there for a good year.
For multiple ones, right? Like he's had 3, he's on his 3rd contract already,
I
I
think it's his
believe.
second. I think they,
I thought they did 2 different renewals. Like he had got his
yeah,
initial contract when he came in, then there
then
was
the
an
renewal,
update, and I feel like there was
then
one more.
another renewal.
Yeah.
So he's on his second 5-year contract.
Hmm.
But yes, his 3rd contract, yes, because he had one contract, they renewed, then they renewed again. So he's on his 3rd contract after 2 renewals.
Yeah. And this is
And then he hasn't, this is before he's finished well, he hasn't been there 5 years. And he's gotten 2 renewed for 2 5-year contracts, which is unheard of.
right, which is unheard of, which she mentioned about Rodriguez getting a 5-year contract. Now, this is after Rodriguez proved his mettle,
Yeah.
got them off of basically, financial probation, right? Having
Mm-hmm.
an overseeing body checking everything that they do before they can get it approved. He came up with the 5-year facilities plan and whatnot to
Right.
get the school on the right track,
Mm-hmm.
um, which it hadn't been for quite some time, right? These are some real tangible gains we are seeing under his
Yep.
tenure. So yeah, I found that very curious.
Yeah. Well, let's first of all, he left.
Hmm.
He didn't get fired, but one could say that he was kind of driven away. And if
Yes,
you
in your
talk to
reporting, you went on to say that prior to that, within that like year, he um he had some key hires rejected and
right.
whatnot within
Hmm.
his administration that he was
There
trying to
were
set up.
yeah, and there were some, from my perspective, just as not even as a reporter, but as a citizen observing it, there were some that he got some pushback. He got way more pushback than Henderson has gotten, given the drastic changes Henderson has been able to kind of just implement without very little pushback, except from a very, very minor part of the board, a small minority.
Yeah.
Rodriguez, they I mean they were there were I remember debates about him, wanting to restructure his administrative core, not the entire district, but just his administrative core. From what I heard, he was and they were pretty major changes that happened, and if I recall, just one that stuck out in particular. He wanted to, for instance, promote a communications employee to a departmental head or equivalent, and it would have come with us like a $30,000 pay raise or something.
Hmm.
Um, and there was some reasonable criticism coming from people like Della Patterson and Teresa Kelly about some of those personnel changes, and that's you know as there should be with it, when it comes to these administrative changes that quite honestly they happen every time a new superintendent comes in. It's like an unspoken rule. It's almost like aldermanic privilege in the city when they used to have it.
Hmm.
A new superintendent, should have the privilege of hiring his or her or their people.
Yeah.
And typically boards give them that privilege. Um, and Rodriguez, I think, just thought, there were some people on that board who were, for lack of a better term, micromanaging him
Hmm.
um, in a way that you almost wish somebody on the board would micromanage this current superintendent, given what he's done and hasn't done,
Right.
which we will eventually get into. So I think, and I would bring up one other thing, which is key. Rodriguez obviously was Hispanic. And this guy, James Henderson, is black, and I think the importance of those racial distinctions cannot be overstated.
Speaking of that particular distinction, one other thing that I found, I kind of went on a deep dive through your reporting on Proviso District, um, and I think this is within that same article um, about Rodriguez. Before we move on to other parts of this tangled web, but those achievements haven't come without some friction. In April 2018, after the D209 board voted against a series of key hires and staffing adjustments within his office, Rodriguez said he was at a crossroads. And just last week, the board voted 4-2 to reinstate Proviso West principal Nia Abdullah, who Rodriguez had suspended for matters that were not made public, with some board members denouncing the suspension and others claiming that the vote and comments related to it undermined the superintendent. Um, I found very interesting. Ned Wagner said all the data was laid out, and the superintendent asked for the board's advice and direction, and no one on the board said anything. Ned Wagner, school board president, said during the December 10th meeting where the vote was made. I was the only one who said I didn't think it was a good fit. I looked around at everyone and said, okay, the superintendent is asking for direction in this matter. This is our chance. And no one said anything. He said, we told Dr. Rodriguez to do what he saw fit, and the board would back him up. And now we're hanging him out to dry.
Yeah,
What are your thoughts on that?
I think it just reflects the um, overall dysfunction that that was on that board even before Dr. Henderson got.
Mm-hmm.
So I think it was around the time that I probably probably other relatively close observers of the district probably thought, oh, this board is in some respects not a whole lot better than previous iterations, than past boards, um, and you start wondering, is this just endemic to Proviso? Is this just how Proviso has always been and always will be? I would just give you. I had a very long off the record conversation with Principal Abdullah after she left. I want to say it was after she left. I believe, yeah, either after she left or very close to the point when she left. Um, And I've had conversations with very well respected administrators in neighboring districts. Um, I put it like this: I probably talked to half a dozen administrators who used to be at Proviso, or interviewed for positions at Proviso, very high level positions at Proviso, and they all say the same thing: this district is nuts. These people are crazy. That's what one of them literally said to me. Those people are crazy. Um, One said, very highly respected former superintendent at a neighboring district who interviewed for the job of superintendent. This is after the two together supermajority was formed and everything. And they said they set in, they got there a little early, I believe. And so, you're exchanging small talk, niceties, etc. And this person said the way that some board members were talking about other people and gossiping, they voluntarily withdrew. They said there's no way I'm going to that district. Uh, they could see it in the interview process. Um, and I've seen it up close and personal myself several times. It is without saying a whole lot, but I mean everybody sees it at board meetings every month. They see it out in the open. They see it with respect to how some board members react to young people who come up during public comments. It's quite frankly, it's disgusting.
Yeah. Now you mentioned that, there's a story that's been told to me a few different times. I was not at this meeting, but I've been told about it, and I've read some reporting on it. I think reporting that you wrote once again, uh, about Ashley Stoll giving board members peanuts, and how that was construed as a racist act. And but then when I looked further into it and found that, like, Henderson has a thing that he does where he refers to his detractors in the board meetings as the peanut gallery.
Right.
Right. And so, to my mind, I think, okay, did this 15-year-old kid look up 1800s racism? Try and do like a deep cut,
Yeah.
like, racist thing, or was that a
Right.
comment on what she was being called?
Right.
You know, um,
Right.
it just, there seems to
Now,
be.
Ashley Stahl is just for context. She's a white student at Proviso West, who
Yes.
was a student leader, who, along with her peers, had created posters in support of teachers. Some of them critical of the superintendent, and had formed a group of students um, who came together to one, defend teachers who the superintendent had suspended and were on the brink of termination, um, for activity that they didn't that there was no evidence of them doing, and that the superintendent had claimed, without a real basis, according to these teachers. Now, the specific activity that is cited, was, uh, there are allegations that the teachers were helping students, um, with the posters, for instance, or during the strike. There was a 2-3 week long strike last spring at D209, that that the superintendent instigated. Um, if you ask, members of the union, and if you ask observers like myself who know this guy up close, he instigated the strike a week before the strike, when the union and the district were going through negotiations back and forth, and there was talk of a possible strike, students in mass at all 3 high schools across the district walked out during classes, catching many, staffers off guard. And the superintendent's response and some members of the board, their response to this was to say that, well, there were a bunch of parents in Westchester and Forest Park who made the students do this, along with some teachers who made the students walk out. Again, and they made subtle references to race because Westchester and Forest Park are predominantly white. And they made some not so subtle references to specific parents who were white.
Yes.
And again, that was another instance of this administration and some members of the board playing a race card.
Mm.
I mean, that's almost that's a textbook definition of playing a race card. So I want to, before we go forward, I think it's important to state that Proviso Township High School District 209 has institutionally racist roots. Let's just put that out there.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
100%.
Does race come into play in certain things? It absolutely. My great grandmother attended Proviso East High School, and at the time it was the only high school that she could attend because she was Black. Okay, so yes, there are generations of people from Forest Park, from Westchester, who 40 years ago will tell you we don't want to go to school with Black people, if they didn't put it much more crudely.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, Proviso West, deep-seated racial issues that are rooted in housing discrimination, first and foremost, because you go to school where you live. For a long time, Blacks were lived in segregated areas, my family included. I just came from the funeral of my great aunt, who's 90. She was 96 years old. I still remember the house where she grew up in, where we would often go for a lot of family reunions and family get-togethers. That house was in what is today called the colored district of Maywood, because due to housing covenants, racial housing covenants, and other forms of racially restrictive housing practices, Black people could only live in a very constricted part of town in Maywood. It was Black people and Jews. So yes, Proviso has absolutely deep-seated racist roots. The guy who the township was named after, David Wilmot, who was a legislator famous for his Wilmot Proviso, which a lot of liberals will say, oh, was good for Black people because he had that proviso would have banned slavery from certain parts of the country. It never got passed, and it was one of the many things that led up to the Civil War. But David Wilmot was an out and out white supremacist. He is anti-slavery and he was a white supremacist. so yes, Proviso has absolutely deep-seated racial issues, which unfortunately are obscured by all of this playing a race card.
Absolutely. I found some reporting from the 90s. This is in 1994 by H.G. Bissinger in the New York Times. Big article about Proviso School District. And he mentions that of the communities feeding into the Proviso Township High Schools, District 209, these 10 communities, of those communities feeding into the schools, only one, Maywood, had any Black population to speak of in 1960. All the others all had Black populations of less than 1%. It was in this era that Proviso West was spawned, built in the late 1950s with a $6.75 million bond issue. It was more than a school. It was a symbol. At the dedication ceremonies on November 16th, 1958, the words of the American educator James Bryant Conant were invoked. Our purpose is to cultivate in the largest number for our future citizens an appreciation of both the responsibilities and benefits which come to them because they are American and free, which I find laughable. Especially in light of what they were, the white supremacy they were upholding at the
Right.
time.
And there,
And
just to point out, within 30 years, so from 1960 to 1990,
yes,
you go from all of those towns with 1% black population having 70%, 80% black population, and white people just having left these
the white
communities.
flight.
Why?
Yeah,
Exactly. Why? Because of the Fair Housing Act that was passed later in the 60s.
hmm and as those people left, so did their dollars. There was a distinct divestment
Right.
from Proviso by white communities, which leads me into another one of these threads that we're looking at. So we've talked a bit about the racial tension thread, and this I think kind of goes hand in hand with that, and that's the very quick demographic shift.
Yes.
Right. So in the 50s, right, what we said 99% white throughout most of Proviso District, to the 80s. By the time you get to the 80s, it's Maywood in particular, which already had a bit of a black population, but it was still majority white back in the 50s. Um, is up to what, like 80% black.
Yep.
In 2005, it was still like 80% black
Yeah.
in
Well,
Proviso District, according to the Illinois State Board of Education Illinois report card for Proviso District.
yep.
In the last time that they were able to actually have that assessment, it's real murky in the last couple of years because of COVID.
Right.
But the last time we have concrete numbers on the demographic, it's like 75, like almost 75% Latinx.
That I know definitely at PMSA it is. It could be possibly that across the district. You're right.
Yeah,
It's at least 65% at this point.
right. And so like that's a big shift.
Well, and even more pointedly, or that number that you referenced, I think it's probably like 75% at PMSA, which is the
hmm
best school in the district, in this 3 school district. Um, 70
98% graduation, 4-year graduation rate, which is
exactly over
awesome.
exactly, and over 70% of the kids who go there are Latin.
Yeah.
Um, which has that alone, among some members of the community who are African American, that kind of causes some tension as well,
hmm
because now you get into this debate, this dialogue about who is entitled to resources.
hmm
um, and unfortunately, this is the thing. We have a majority. Yes, we have a majority. uh, I would think it's fair to say that the board is majority black. At least the board majority that votes and gets votes passed most of the time is black.
That block of 4. Yeah.
Right. Yes. For at times 5, perhaps.
Three of which
Yeah.
are black.
Right. Right. And so you have a school district that's overwhelmingly Hispanic at this point, um, controlled by a block of black board members. And what does that mean on the day-to-day level? Well, you got a lot of students will tell you that there is a lack of Spanish translation resources, for instance. You got they just simply have not devoted the kind of resources when it comes to servicing a largely Latina student body that you would expect. And that is also a sticking point. That's a really large, glaring absence to have one translator in a whole high school building that's predominantly Latina.
Yeah.
You know, to just really not have have a robust Spanish speaking support apparatus in that district is really disappointing. And I think that's something that I would say, I don't want to speak for her, but I think it's fair to say that that Claudia, who's the only Latina on the, well, yeah, she's the only Latina woman on the board. And Sam Valtierra is also Latina. So there are two Latina individuals on the board, and I would say probably both of them would say there needs to be more.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that's actually something that Sam Valtierra has probably voiced openly in various board meetings. Definitely Claudia has. So there's that tension. There's also the tension that all of these concerns are valid, mind you. There are concerns among the Black board members that we're just getting to the point where there's a Black history course, for instance, which was put into place at the insistence of Rodney Alexander when he was board president. And so, according to in their minds, they're thinking, look, we barely got in a position to even bring resources to our own. We hear you, but y'all gonna have to, you're gonna have to
Wait your turn.
you gonna have to wait your turn.
Yeah.
Because we Black, and we Black people got issues, we got needs that require targeted focus, not all-inclusive focus. This a rising tide lifts all boats universalism that often works to the detriment of Black people and also other minorities. So I think that's their perspective.
You mentioned Claudia. Real quick, let me cut to a clip I have of Claudia. In preparation for this, I did 3 one-on-one interviews. These will be dropping all today as well. One with Claudia Medina, one with Rodney Alexander, and one with Proviso West teacher Krista Gillespie. I have a clip here from Claudia talking a bit about where what changed, where how did all of this kind of happen, where did it all fall apart. So let's listen to what she had to say about this. A bit about what changed.
Sure. In 2020, we hired a new superintendent, and the form of communication has been, and leadership style is not collaborative. Mm-hmm. He doesn't understand collaboration. Unfortunately, he engages in a very divisive style of leadership where it's his way or the highway. He has, he's done humongous budget cuts, calling them cost savings, but those support systems that were put in place for our students that were giving us so many gains have been gutted. Deans have been gutted, so there's no discipline and emotional support for our students any longer. He negotiated, it was so hostile that we ended up going into a strike. So he very much enamored, let's say, a board majority, and has based their communication style on, I would say, divisive language that can be incredibly hate-based, unfortunately, divisive-based. When we had done so much coalition building, anyone who spoke out against the changes or against the policies because there was going to be an impact that was going to be negative for the students, or if there was a budgetary impact, was immediately equated to somebody who was hating of somebody because of their racial background. And that is absolutely false. I mean, accountability and racism are not the same thing. And accountability is hard. I mean, when you've been in advocacy as much as I have, when you hold people accountable, you piss a lot of people off, and I did. I have no fear about being vocal. It's the way that you get change. It's the way that you make sure that the message gets out. And so I really became an advocate for the teachers and for the students on the board versus somebody who would kowtow to what the whims of a board majority and the superintendent were. This birthed, obviously, a tense relationship because all decisions were made behind closed doors and has not been inclusive in any way, shape, or form. Meaning that all decisions are made in private meetings prior to coming to the board meeting, which is an OMA violation, and documents or information are not given at the same time to board members that disagree with this disparaging and destruction that has gone on with the district.
So that was Claudia kind of, giving her narrative. Now, in these conversations I had with these three individuals, I didn't really speak much. I just asked questions and then kind of let them just tell their narrative. I didn't give any pushback on any of their answers or anything like that. I just wanted them to have a place where they could give me their unfiltered narrative, and I will be posting those in their entirety, unedited, on the Collectivist YouTube page to add a bit of context to this conversation that we're having about these various things, because I don't think anybody here is doing anything maliciously. I think everybody is doing what they believe is best for the community, but we are not in alignment, right? The one thing I very much agree with in that clip of Claudia is the fact that she said that there's not coalition building, that things are very divisive. I think that's pretty obvious from what we're seeing, from teachers filing lawsuits against the district and board, a board that wanted to take away videotaping, right, making things less accessible, less transparent. These are not things that build coalitions. Mike, what do you think about that clip?
I think Claudia was pretty spot on. Racism is not accountability, or accountability is not racism, I believe is what she said. There has been a lack of there has been a breakdown of coalition building within this current board majority, and certain members of the board have been very, very divisive and defensive. Some of them you can't even have a conversation with about these issues. I've told this to last year at the all alumni picnic that Proviso East held at the Forest Preserve in Forest Park. I had a long, at times tense conversation, but very honest conversation with Rodney Alexander about some of these issues. And I felt at that time that he was gaslighting me, and I told him, and I said, I feel like the community, I feel like you are gaslighting the community. When people raise legitimate concerns and you either say they're not real or they're somehow not rooted in good faith.
Mm-hmm. Let's listen to Rodney's perspective on this. I think it's a good time to bring that in, if you don't mind, real quick, before you continue on that thread.
Sure.
Let's hear his words on whether or not the district is heading in the right direction. So, in your opinion, in your narrative, in your purview, you feel like this is a move in the right direction. Now, of course, we have a lot of people that think that this is not the move in the right direction. Mm-hmm. And I know that there's been some contentious board meetings in that and whatnot. What's it been like to navigate that?
Understanding the truth. A lot of people, if you sat them down and asked you to explain what's wrong, they couldn't tell you. There are things that they don't like.
Mhm.
Well, no one likes change.
Mhm.
But they couldn't show you factually anything that's wrong. As a matter of fact, the district's on a trajectory towards greatness. We're just getting better and better, facility-wise, financial-wise, academic-wise. But you're dealing with culture and climate, and that's always a very hard thing. We're not talking about numbers. Numbers just sit there and do what you tell them to do. But there's a culture and climate in this district and in this township of failure. And people don't, it's been here so long that I don't believe a lot of people even know what success looks like, because that's all we've really gotten. But it's very difficult. But listen, man, I'm a black man. I make no bones about it. Dr. Henderson's a black man. If we were doing something illegal or wrong, we wouldn't be able to stay in this town. It's not even possible. And some of the slander and things that are said about this man are just unconscionable, because there's no fact or proof to him. But we live in a society now where you don't really have to have facts. You tell a lie long enough and stick with it, eventually people start to believe it. And then there's that racial undertone that's just there. That's just real. That's just real, because all the superintendent does is what the board asks him to do.
What do you think about that?
I think that's just another example of Rodney of gaslighting. When he said everybody who has problems with the district, for some reason nobody has information that is valid but him and the people who support what's happening in the board majority and what the superintendent is doing. There are people who have plenty of information. There are former teachers and current teachers who can tell you, who have looked at very hard at all kinds of data, and they have their own direct experience that they can pull from too, which is valid. So you can't tell people you don't know what you're talking about every single time when they come to you with the criticism. And this is not me being biased toward or against anybody. This is just an observation that I think is rooted in my values as somebody who cares about other people being heard and having their experiences validated. As a community leader, to talk that way about people when you preside over a district that went through nearly a month of kids not being in school during a pandemic, who have been complaining about the fact that the water in the water fountains doesn't work, that hallways are so chaotic and violent, some kids are afraid to walk through them. Some teachers are afraid. Speaking to counselors like I have, who are saying that they were retaliated against, they almost lost their jobs because they were bringing up very valid concerns that they were experiencing as employees in a hostile work environment. And they would take these concerns to the board, and that's how that clip right there is how they would be treated. That's the fact that you absolutely can do lots of illegal stuff in Proviso and anywhere else for a very long time. So and we have, in fact, Rodney ran on the ticket. Proviso Together was created because they felt, at least, there were a lot of people doing illegal things. There were leaders, people in elite positions within this district who were doing illegal things for a long time. And they were so tired of it because they thought it was affecting the education of their children and their community members and their community, their reputation, that they surrendered their personal lives and a good portion of their personal lives so that they could be activists and run people for local school boards that is not the presidency of the United States. Like these people, and Rodney is one of them. He ran. It's a whole coalition of them all across the district. They ran because they all of them felt things have been bad for so long, and Rodney was talking the same way that people he considers are slamming the superintendent without validity. He was talking the same way that those people are talking before he got in office. And I think the appropriate thing at the time for anybody in leadership would have been, when Rodney was not a board member, would have been to say, Rodney, I appreciate your concerns. They're valid. This is how we're going to, even if they may not be valid or you don't think they're valid. Anybody in leadership should not talk to a Rodney Alexander outside of leadership the way a Rodney Alexander in leadership talks to any citizen outside of leadership, or even people in leadership who are not in agreement with him. And there's a record of this, the same way that there's a record of Teresa Kelly saying one thing about one superintendent, literally reversing and doing something completely different. I mean, people can have radical changes, and they can have radical changes of mind and of heart, perhaps. But it just shows, like, a lot of this stuff, it's hard to pin down what people's motivations are when they refuse to engage in good faith dialogue. And I think that's what's a big portion of this is people in leadership refusing to engage in good faith dialogue and to hear the vast majority of community members who have valid concerns about the things that are happening in the district. And I say that as somebody who is actually, I like Rodney. Teresa Kelly goes to my family church, so like I know these people, and I've had really valid, really frank conversations with them that I'm having right now. So none of this that I'm saying would be considered a surprise to any of them. And I think that we as a community need to get back to the point where we can have real valid conversations, and we can have healthy criticisms that are not rooted in, I don't like you, or what you're saying is just evil. You're bad. I don't want to hear you because you're just bad. You're ignorant. You don't know what you're talking about. I mean, that type of dialogue is not very healthy, and it doesn't get anyone anywhere. And but that's the point where this district is at, unfortunately.
And we're not saying that their concerns are not valid. They absolutely are. Like, right? We know
absolutely.
that Black children have been historically underserved in this community.
Absolutely, and they've done some good stuff too. Rodney has done good stuff on the board. They've done some. All these people have at various points done some good stuff in their position as board members, regardless of who they are. But we have to be able to isolate instances where, depending on the information, or depending on one's experience, that instances where one person feels the need to point out something that the other is doing that person may not feel is right or appropriate or transparent or what have you. Yeah.
I want to play another clip. We've heard from the board members, but I really want to hear the teacher perspective of what's going on in this district. This is Crystal Gillespie speaking on her reflections on where did it all fall apart.
All right.
You got Rodriguez in place, and he's doing great, and everybody's excited about the positive changes happening in the district. Where did it all fall apart? Like, can you talk a bit about that?
And I'm gonna preface this with because I'm constantly reflecting on that same idea. When did it fall apart? Mm-hmm. Because one, I always reflect on it because I never want to put blame on someone or some particular body where the blame doesn't need to be. But also as someone who's currently running a slate of candidates, I want to make sure that I'm reflecting on that, because I want to know, where did it turn left with this group when it was going well, to try to avoid those pitfalls. And so in my opinion, I think it just went left when the configuration of the board changed, the relationships of the board changed. And then there was this, it just seemed like all at once people on the board that were cordial and able to work together were not. And then you started really hearing, and I think this is just really unpopular to say. And you know, one of the things, and I've been called a lot of things by, you know, people that look like me, because I don't mind calling it out and calling it for what it is. But we started talking a lot about race, and race is always going to be an issue. But we went from trying to figure out how to be one proviso to, you're doing this or saying this because this is a Black superintendent, or we're talking about, you know, systemic racism, and systemic racism exists in every facet of life. But as I look at things, and I'm an educator, an African-American educator, I'm also looking at it and saying, well, the leaders, the educational decision makers in the district that I'm in, where you're talking about all this, look like me. So what's going on here? Are we using smoke screens, or is this really happening? So I think that when your focuses turn away from the students, then everything went left, because now it seemed like it wasn't about students, it's about one person or a board majority, or, you know, it's always kind of been contentious between, you know, admin and teachers, but now it's being broken down even more by, you know, race. But then there's this contradiction, because I can get on board with, I believe that we need more representation in education, most definitely. I also know that some of the teachers that saved my life did not necessarily share my culture. As a long-term teacher in this district, what pains me, and I don't want to choke up now, is that because I'm asking questions, and I'm asking questions because I'm concerned about Black and brown students, because that's who I teach, that people that look like me want to attack my Blackness. I wear that every day. My dedication to
in your earrings. Which I love, by the way. They're fire.
Yeah. Because I believe that Black students need certain things, and we should be providing those things. But I also believe, as an educator, I can't pick and choose who I'm teaching. You can't pick and choose, as representatives of a district, you can't pick and choose which group of students you're going to service. Because in my classroom, I don't have only Black students. In my classroom, I have a variety of students. And you're not giving me the resources as my educational leaders to provide for any of those students. So when I think about when things went left, and they've been going left, it's going to board meetings, and the board meetings look more like Jerry Springer episodes than business meetings or meetings of the mind. when students and again, board members and the superintendent are not in our buildings every day. We are in the buildings every day. When I see my students not getting services, that's a problem. And it should be a problem for anybody sitting on that board.
Yeah. Very powerful words from Carissa. What do you think about that?
Yeah, as she was speaking, I just kept thinking back to she was talking about, you know, this contradiction between the racism that is often claimed by board members and superintendent and perhaps some administrators versus the reality of a largely African American leadership body in the district. As she was pointing that out, I was thinking of, and I actually have it on me. Been reading a very good book called Elite Capture. How the powerful took over identity politics and everything else. And I just want to read a few very short passages because I think they're very germane to what is happening in the district and what Carissa was just talking about. So first, he defines what an elite is, according to a political scientist that he cites. The author is called, his name is Olufemi Otaiwo. I think I'm pronouncing that. Maybe I'm mispronouncing it. But he quotes another political scientist to define an elite. And he says an elite refers to a small group of people who have power over a larger group of which they are part, usually without direct responsibility to that larger group, and often without their knowledge or consent. That's an elite. Elite capture, and I'm quoting from Taiwo now, elite capture happens when the advantaged few steer resources and institutions that could serve the many toward their own narrower interests and aims. And then he goes on and says, points out, in the absence of the right kind of checks or constraints, the subgroup of people, the elite, with power over and access to the resources used to describe, define, and create political realities, in other words, the elites, will capture the group's values, forcing people to coordinate on a narrower social project that disproportionately represents elite interests. When elites run the show, the interests of the group get whittled down to what they have in common with those at the top at best. At worst, elites fight for their own narrow interests using the banner of group solidarity. I think that's exactly what we're seeing in Proviso. There's elite capture, and these elites at the top of the district are fighting for their own narrow interests using the banner of Black solidarity.
Yeah. Last thing I want to touch on before we call it, we're running a little bit long here. But the last thing I want to touch on, and I feel like we have danced around it a bit, but I want to kind of narrow in on it a bit. Superintendent Henderson, do you believe, as Rodney said, that he is doing a good job, in your opinion? Do you see evidence of perhaps mismanagement on the superintendent level? I just love to hear your perspective on that.
Well, let's just say what happened the last few weeks. 4 female teachers, current and former, filed a lawsuit against the superintendent and the district that holds the superintendent liable both personally and in his capacity as the head of the district, or as the administrative head of the district. That happened March 6th is when that lawsuit was filed. There are other lawsuits out there, at least one other. A former top administrator who, if I'm not mistaken, was in fact hired by Dr. Henderson, filed a lawsuit, I believe last year. And this was a guy who was hired by the superintendent. There have been other people who have flirted with lawsuits. There are too many people to count who probably would bring a lawsuit if they were not afraid of retaliation and afraid of losing their job, or afraid of the fallout threatening their careers. So you have the lawsuits. You have the people who have spoken about how it is to work with this person, with Dr. Henderson. I myself was recruited to work for Dr. Henderson, and I've written about this in a commentary for Wednesday Journal, the paper I used to write for. He called me up this was 2 years ago, I'm going to say 2 or 3 years ago, called me up. It's not long. It's about a week, perhaps maybe a year into him being there. He came during the pandemic, I think around 2020. And I probably interviewed him at length once or twice. And he felt that, the fact that, I was publishing content for another newspaper, Forest Park Review, which I also wrote for, in my own newspaper, Village Free Press, which I used to publish. I would publish Forest Park Review content that was written by a white woman, former white reporter who used to work at the paper. I published her education content in Village Free Press, which is the newspaper I started. And when he called me up one night, he said, "Why are you doing this to a black man?" or something to that extent. And I said, "Doing what to a black man?" My exact questions, my exact question. And he said, talked about me sharing Forest Park Review content in Village Free Press. That was really just, it could have been, we could have, and I wish we had dug a lot deeper into what was happening. But they were talking about his time in Mississippi. There were articles about other things. He had, in fact, recommended disbanding the finance committee on the school board. I don't believe that's a good thing to do. Mm-hmm. He had, when he first came in, within less than 6 months, I would say, he introduced a drastic restructuring of the district, which included getting rid of deans and certain department heads or certain in-school administrators who, who in not a very, no school environment is perfect. But I've talked with staffers on the ground, building level staffers, in recent weeks, who say that was one of the worst things that he could have done. The special education department is possibly in violation of federal laws. You go on and on. So this was the stuff that came immediately out of this restructuring that we were touching the surface of it. Back in the early days when he was first hired. And of course he came in under some pretty tense circumstances. He was one of two candidates, both of them black men. And he was hired over this other candidate who Claudia had known, but she did not disclose the fact that she knew the other candidate, and she still voted. I think that was what ruptured a lot of people's relationship between Claudia and other school board members. That's when it really, really went south. And then it kind of just got even worse from that point on. So, we were reporting some of this stuff, didn't even report a lot of the other stuff that we were getting handed by some people about his time in Mississippi. I actually spent a long time talking with a former subordinate of his in his Holmes County district in Mississippi, who told me point blank that if you hire this guy, he will blow up your district. And I just didn't have enough sourcing to go on because it's just this guy. And I even interviewed another board member who said we didn't have a huge problem with the guy. So I couldn't go with the story, but he would, to suffice it to say, he didn't feel comfortable with us reporting anything of real substance, I think. So he called me up one night. He sounded like he was drinking. I'm just going to be, I mean, he was slurring his words and stuff. He asked me not to record the conversation. And then eventually he said, you know, come work for me. And I said, you have a communications director already who was an African-American woman. And he told me, don't worry about all that. His exact words. And he said, and I'm just I'm entertaining this to entertain it. At no point am I even remotely considering saying, okay, sure, over a phone call, like I'm going to disrupt my career in local journalism and come work for you. But at any rate, I say, well, you know, I got a newspaper. And he said, oh yeah, we'll pay for that too. You can have a newspaper and you can work for me. And I said, have you spoken to the board? He said, I got the board's permission. This was all over the course of a random, it wasn't late night, but it was late enough phone call. And I remember thinking, this guy is problematic at best. I even eventually asked Rodney, I said, you know, the guy offered me a job as eventually communications head. At one point in the conversation, I'm leaving this out, the superintendent said, you know, wouldn't you like to be making six figures? And I said, at this point, I acted like I stopped acting as if, you know, I was interested. And I said, look, I'm going to be straight up and honest with you. Please don't ever have this conversation with any other reporter again. Because I could be recording this call. Not all reporters are me. I didn't record it. I didn't tell him I wouldn't share it though. But I said, in his own interest, as one black man to another, I felt it. I wanted to say, look, why are you doing this? Because you could jeopardize your own career. If I were recording this conversation, and if anybody, if it came out, heard that conversation and was still okay with this guy, they need to be examined. Yeah. So I said, you shouldn't be doing this. This is not appropriate. One. Secondly, I don't believe communications people in school districts should be making six figures. That's just what I don't believe that on principle. A lot of people may call me radical or crazy. I don't think that what they do justifies it. But to a deeper point though, and this goes beyond just him. And I think I've talked to you about this in private conversations, but I've also had conversations with other people who have tracked James Henderson's career trajectory. And I mean, it's pretty out in the open, actually. He either looks up to or considers perhaps a mentor like former director of education, U.S. education, U.S. What do they call him? He's head of the Federal Department of Education.
The Secretary of Education.
Yeah, Secretary of Education. And I believe in the Bush administration, Rod Page, who I think is out of Texas, which is where Dr. Henderson worked at some time. He's invited Dr. Page to come speak, etc. Rod Page and George Bush and that administration, you know, what's their main educational accomplishment, if they or their main educational measure or a piece of legislation, if you want to call it that, or proposal? It's No Child Left Behind. And if you see, if you just follow the logic of No Child Left Behind, which, to be fair, Barack Obama simply modified and adapted. It was he made a liberal version of that with his Race to the Top education program. which was just No Child Left Behind light. But all of it is premised on this idea of capitalistic competition, ruthless competition that emphasizes test scores. It emphasizes data. It emphasizes an approach to education that if you study, or if you just do some light reading on the history of American education in this country, is rooted in industrialization. It's this idea that we need to educate young people to feed the economy, essentially. Or another way to say it is to be fed to the economy. Whatever you do, the point of you going to school and leaving is to get a job so that you can make money. But more importantly, I think if you get even higher in higher education circles, the real goal, especially among Republican administrations, is to make sure that we train kids in our country to do whatever the economy needs them to do. So if we need, in the early 20th century, we needed factory workers. So the point of schooling, according to business elites and to political elites that ran the country, was to educate young people to be the industrial workforce, to work in factories. And then as the economy modernized, quote, so to speak, and jobs became less blue collar and more white collar, the point of education was to make sure we educated young people to feed to feed into this white collar economy. Regardless of what kind of education it is, regardless of whether or not we're actually training kids to be critical thinkers, regardless of whether or not we're training them to know the history to know real Black history, to know real African American studies, which is not what this new AP American Studies, African American Studies course is, and that's a whole nother conversation. But none of this kind of industrial-based education, where you emphasize and you incentivize school districts, principals, teachers to teach to the test, where you incentivize them then, and what you get, what economists call a perverse incentive. You get a perverse incentive to cheat, which is what happened. You see all these cheating scandals with people who were regarded as heroes in the education movement. Michelle Rhee, for instance, I think she was she was former head of schools in DC.
Yeah.
The Atlanta cheating scandal, all these cheating scandals. And then if you follow back in James Henderson's Curricula Vitae, he is about a stone's throw from these kinds of scandals. I'm not saying though the exact scandals, but he's adjacent to this philosophy of education that is deeply harmful to kids as human beings, but is meant to be helpful to the economy.
Right. It's rooted in capitalism.
It's rooted in exploitative. It's rooted in the worst kind of capitalism, because you're not training kids to be.
I think I lost you, Mike. Mike, you cut out. You cut out for a second there.
Oh, can you hear me?
Yeah. Can you repeat what you just said, please?
I'm sorry. Am I back now? I had a phone.
Yeah, you're back.
I'm sorry. I said. Yeah. It's not training. You're not even training kids to flourish in capitalism, because in order to flourish in capitalism, you have to be creative. You got to be innovative. You have to know how to exploit opportunities to make money. And how we teach kids under the No Child Left Behind rubric, under this idea that these kids are basically pods, or they're basically cogs in a machine that should be disciplined, and they need to do what we tell them. They need to regurgitate the material that they're taught, and make sure they do well on the test and get out of here before they graduate, etc. This very routinized idea of education does not train young people to be able to be successful in the economy that we have currently. So it's not even doing that. And you see how the superintendent treats kids now. when all these young people walked out of school in last February in support of teachers. And what did the administration and some members of the board do in response? They said these kids they must not be this smart. It must be some white adults behind this. It must be some conspiratorial teachers behind this. These kids they can't possibly have just decided and made up on their own that they were going to walk out and protest in support of teachers. I've had this conversation with Rodney Alexander, who told me, I told him, Rodney, maybe they walked out and maybe they support the teachers because maybe they walked out because they support the teachers. Rodney told me, well, yeah, they would support the teachers. They with them every day.
Yeah, that's a very good point. Exactly. These are the people that take care of them. I mean, like, that's their community. Their community are the teachers.
Exactly. And so the idea that these students organized and they got political. They weren't practicing politics. They were practicing what one philosopher, a favorite philosopher, a political philosopher of mine, Sheldon Wolin, calls the political. And he distinguishes the political from politics. And when you're practicing the political, you're not practicing elite capture. You're practicing trying to agitate and trying to work out a solution to the common good. Solidarity, standing with a community that is trying to equitably disperse resources for the common good, as opposed to politics, which is the day-to-day warfare for scarce resources between often unequal players. So a school board, for instance, trying to hoard resources for their own narrow interests, as opposed for the common good. That's politics. That's petty politics. And so the idea that some people in power at District 209 can't feasibly imagine young people actually being able to stand in solidarity with the people who care about them the most and do something that was political, but that was for the common good. The idea that that's kind of foreign to some people in leadership in Proviso, that's really disappointing.
That's very incredibly disappointing. And we're gonna put a pin in it right there, and we're gonna have more conversations about this. Full disclosure, I got very, very sick this week and fell a little bit behind and wasn't able to get the full panel that I wanted to. We are going to continue to have these conversations because this isn't a one-time thing. We want people to be able to be in conversation with us and as a community to continue to talk about these issues. What Mike just ended on, though, brings me to what I wanted to bring this home with, right? We just talked about all these various issues of race and classism and whatnot. And for this board, for the superintendent, not to believe in these students having a say in what's going on is kind of a slap in the face to perhaps the most famous graduate of Proviso East, Chairman Fred Hampton. And so I wanted to end with this a very famous quote from the chairman. We don't think you fight fire with fire best. We think you fight fire with water best. We're not going to fight racism. We're going to fight racism, not with racism, but we're going to fight with solidarity. We say we're not going to fight capitalism with black capitalism, but we're going to fight it with socialism. This is, going into like a lot of the roots of our civil rights push just here locally in our neighborhood, looking at the history of it, the things that the services that Chairman pioneered, right? Like those still exist today, right? Like governmental structures took them on because they were just so freaking effective. Empower your youth to have a voice and have a say in the conversation. It's very important. These students need to be able to say, hey, this is how we as a student body want and need to be represented. That should be listened to. I really want to thank you, Michael, for sitting with me. I know this went about half hour longer than it was supposed to, but this was such a wonderful conversation. I'm going to thank you for all of your knowledge and your insights and your continued reporting on what's happening in our community.
Thanks for having me, Maui.
Yeah,
and this platform is powerful, and I appreciate you you doing this.
Oh, thank you so much. Be sure to subscribe to Michael's Substack, where he's posting his reporting directly to the community. He's also working in partnership with the Collectivist and reporting through there. In fact, you can go on collectivistmedia.org right now and read his reporting on the District 209 teachers that are filing a First Amendment lawsuit. Also be on the lookout for his deep dive. Well, I guess we kind of did in collaboration our deep dive on the charter school situation that is emerging as well. We'll definitely talk about that in our follow-up conversations about Proviso District, because that's a whole other thing that's now part of the narrative, where now you have this new faction that wants to open a charter school in the district. And so that it's just a lot going on. There's so much going on, and impossible to cover it in one day. So be sure to follow us on Facebook, Instagram, collectivistmedia.org for updates and more information about the change makers and issues we are highlighting on this show. Don't forget to like and subscribe and click the bell so you get notified when we have new episodes. Feel free to share it with your family. Share this one far and wide, especially if you are in any of the 10 communities that make up Proviso District. Thank you very much, and echo love. Peace.